Hello, this is Janae from the Conscious Community Podcast and Conscious Community Magazine. We wanted to let you know that we have sponsorship packages available. If you are interested in sponsoring this podcast, please email Spencer at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com or call or text 630-492-0831. 630-492-0831. Thank you very much for listening. We appreciate all of you. Conscious Community Podcast is brought to you by Conscious Community Magazine, America's oldest metaphysical magazine, continuously in print since 1979. We feature articles about nutrition, holistic living, yoga, healing, and much more in each monthly issue, as well as regular columns and a comprehensive events calendar and community happening section.
Hello, welcome to the Conscious Community Podcast. Today we're speaking with Susan Wisehart about her book Soul Visioning, Clear the Past and Create Your Future. Welcome to the show, Susan.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We're happy to have you. Well, the first thing we'd like to ask you is you have a background as a marriage and family therapist and a psychotherapist. Can you tell us a little more about your background and what brought you into this type of work?
I work more holistically, integrating mind, body, and spirit. I used to work more traditionally, but as I evolved and became more spiritual in my practice on a personal level, my professional practice also evolved. I found that incorporating more holistic types of therapies got to the root of issues when mind, body, and spirit is balanced. So over the years, I've incorporated a lot of different modalities into my practice that go beyond talk therapy. Things like hypnotherapy, energy, psychology, past life and life between lives regression, more experiential kind of work that gets to the root of issues, cellular memory, to help connect people more deeply with their soul purpose, their soul essence. And I found that people got better faster using these approaches. It wasn't just putting a Band-Aid on an issue. So it's been deeply fulfilling doing this work, and I've been doing it for, I've lost count now, over 25 years, something like that.
I saw that you work a lot with your husband. How does your relationship and work-life balance play out for you guys? And do you have any advice to couples who work together, like Spencer and I?
Well, I feel very, very fortunate to be with my soulmate, my husband, who actually is an environmental engineer, but he's also very metaphysical. We each have our businesses. You know, I have my private practice as a holistic psychotherapist, and, you know, he's an energy engineer consultant, but we also have this common interest of soul growth. So we teach classes together, we do workshops together, and we're very much on the same wavelength. But it's not like our work is 100% together all the time. So, you know, we pursue some of our own interests and directions, but we also have the benefit of supporting each other's soul path. And I'm very, very grateful for that. We both have done a lot of work on ourselves in terms of being able to get to the point of having this kind of relationship. We both were previously married and were in what I would call karmic relationships, where there was unfinished business in those previous relationships. There were still lessons that were being learned there. So when those lessons were complete, you know, there's divine timing with our soul contract. Our soul contract came up for us to come together and do the work that we agreed to do in this lifetime. So we're both very, very grateful for that.
You mentioned how you've gone from more traditional modalities towards more spiritual ones. That's something that's come up before when we had a guest who talked about like spiritual healing practices, that a lot of times some of the more like medical or psychotherapy type approaches are oriented towards treating symptoms, which is not to say they're right or wrong, but just in my own experience going through this process and what I've seen with some of the people we've talked to, that whatever you may believe, that for millennia, that spiritual practices are how people have healed. And it's the mode that we've used to heal ourselves since before history. And just because we decided in the last couple hundred years that it was superstitious mumbo jumbo doesn't change that it's kind of the way we're built. So whether or not you believe that it's true or don't believe that it's true, it does work in sometimes very measurable ways to, like I've seen, shamanic healing ceremonies. Somebody will go to therapy and they'll try the medications and nothing works, and then they have a tribal healing ceremony and it heals them. There's something worth looking at there because I think there's more to it than can be easily dismissed. So I could definitely see how you could, over the course of your career, be more interested in that.
Yeah, and, I think scientifically we don't have the paradigms to measure some of these alternative modalities. I'm basing the work that I do on what I've seen over 25 years, what works and what doesn't work, and what's effective and what isn't. And because I saw benefits and results using these methods, it has definitely made me a big believer. My purpose is not to try to prove it. Is it effective? Are people benefited by it? And in my experience, they are.
Yeah, that's my psychology professor, when I first started college, actually told a story that I think about a lot, which is he had a patient who was convinced that he was electrified and that if he touched anybody, they would die. He had been medicated and he had been institutionalized and nothing worked. He was still completely convinced of this. And the standard psychiatric approach would be to medicate him and convince him it's not true. What this professor of mine did when he got this patient is he went and they use these little anti-static strips in electrical engineering, like if you're working on circuitry. Mm-hmm. And he said, put this on your ankle and it'll ground you and you won't electrocute anybody. And the guy put it on his ankle and he was fine after that. Like he could hold a job. He was, as long as he had his little grounding strip, he knew he was safe and he wasn't going to electrocute anyone. Now, was he really electrified? Was he really, going to electrocute people? Probably not. But it was counterproductive to try and convince him that his belief was wrong, whereas showing him how he could get better by something that's, seems to maybe somebody who doesn't believe in that stuff to be irrational actually worked, and he's better and now he can live his life and be happy.
Yes, the power of belief. Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Speaking of belief and basically coming into, I suppose, believing in ourselves, Carl Jung is famous for saying that until we make the unconscious conscious, it'll direct our lives and we will call it fate. A lot of it seemed to me in your book as you were trying to help people find these unconscious blocks, these unconscious issues in their lives that have been making decisions for them, whether or not they realize it. They're running a computer program. I think one of these first things that you talked about was the learning to trust your own intuition. Do you have any advice for people who are trying to find how to trust themselves and how to really know the difference between what is a strong, intuitive sense that's worth listening to?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And, there's a lot of, myths and programming that leads us to misbelieve or distrust, intuition and limiting beliefs, and 95% of the mind is unconscious. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book, Soul Visioning, is I saw a lot of the models, the manifestation models, show the power of the mind to manifest and create your life and all of that, but there were some things that were missing, and one of them is what part of the mind is doing the manifesting. What part of the mind is in charge. And if it's not the soul, then the ego can manifest all kinds of things, but not necessarily happiness or peace of mind. The second thing that was missing is it did not address the unconscious mind, the 95% of the limiting beliefs that are in the unconscious mind. That those programs that are running in the background that hold us back. No matter what you do, it's not good enough. You'll never measure up. Life is a struggle. So I felt that we have to be in touch with what blocks us, what holds us back, to being in touch with our soul, which is our intuition. The language of the soul is the intuition. So the more we clear the baggage, the more we remove the blocks to our soul, and our higher self, our true self, the more we're going to be in touch with that inner GPS. So in my book, I have methods to identify what some of these sabotaging beliefs are, these patterns that hold us back, and ways of releasing them. For example, like using energy psychology, some of the meridian therapies, the tapping therapies that help to release some of those barriers. So the more clear we are, the more our personality is aligned with our soul, the more in touch we're going to be with our intuition.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that probably the first step there is learning to love yourself and, finding selfless self-love. Do you have any advice for our readers or listeners about how to tap more into that part of ourselves?
Well, our true nature is love. Our true self is our soul. We are a spark of the divine. As we become more aware of our patterns and programs that have affected our sense of ourself and block that sense of self, we've internalized a lot of programs from our family of origin, internalized the, critical parent, so to speak. We've even carried over past life patterns that affect us. The more we are aware and conscious of these patterns, the more we can clear the blocks to love, because that is our true nature. So I do past life regression with people to help identify what some of those limiting beliefs are and patterns. Hypnotherapy helps to get to the root of that. So I think it's self-awareness. Does that make sense? It's like the more we understand what's holding us back. When those are cleared and those sabotaging parts are set aside, what's left is our essence, that sense of connection to the divine within us.
I'm familiar with the manifestation psychology and energy work, and a lot of my personal self-study has been like Taoism and Buddhism. And I think a lot of these concepts came into Western understanding through those traditions. We talked with some Buddhist leaders and we talked with a Taoist monk last episode. The one thing about the positive manifestation psychology that I feel needs to be clarified, and this is just my perspective on it, but I think sometimes people misunderstand and they think all you need to do is think positive thoughts and be positive. And the way I look at it is, if you're beating yourself up and you don't love yourself and you don't believe in yourself and you don't have confidence, then you won't get the things in life that you want to get. Once you get to the point of self-acceptance and self-love and finding your purpose, you have to do the physical steps necessary to reach those goals too. That I feel like a lot of people, they get as far as the positive manifestation and then they just stop. They're not acting to do those things. And then eventually they're going to start, beating themselves up again and feeling like they're a failure because nothing happened when they tried it and it didn't work. And that seems to be a really common misconception. I took a long time to learn how to love myself, and once I learned how to love myself, I started planning out the things I wanted to do in life and overcoming obstacles and checking things off the list and getting where I needed to go. And it's a lot of work and a lot of planning to even, to do something simple. Like we bought a house last summer. We went and did a little magical ritual on the porch when we decided we wanted to get it, and we thought positive, but then we had to do a lot of work to make it happen. That is something I feel like a lot of people miss, and it's really important to
I'm curious,
communicate to people yes, do think positive, but also you got to start
doing that come up a lot in your practice? Do you see people saying that and not doing the work? Yeah,
like magical thinking, that if I say the affirmations and think positive thoughts, do those kinds of things, then it's magically going to show up. And that's not necessarily the case. Talking about intuition, if you're in touch with your soul's guidance, with your intuition guiding you, it will guide you to the steps you need to take. But then you've got to follow your soul's guidance and direction. You can't just think, it's magically going to just show up without me doing anything. So I think that's absolutely correct.
That's actually, I think, one thing that for people who are meticulous planners but maybe aren't in touch with their intuition, that it can seem like magic sometimes when somebody has both. You know, I do a lot of meticulous planning and whatnot, but there's times that I will do something that just seems totally unconnected and people won't understand why I'm doing it. But I'm just like, I trust myself. I know this. Right now, I need to call into sick to work today because I need to get 4 hours of sleep and I need to read this book. And it seems totally irrational to anybody from the outside, but I just know in my gut that that's what I need to do today.
Absolutely.
And if you don't have that connection with intuition, then you can go through all the steps and, when something happens that doesn't fit your plan, you don't know how to adapt and handle it because all you have is, the plan. I mean, that's something I study a lot of military history and it's something that they always say in military planning, which is like your plans evaporate as soon as the battle starts. As soon as reality actually happens, then that's when the intuition kicks in and it's like, okay, well, I planned on, working on my books today, but, if I don't adapt to this situation, my whole plan's going to come apart. So I think it's really important to have both. I love that people are embracing the valid parts of manifestation psychology, but I feel like a lot of them out there in the world that I run into, people have, read books on it or whatever, like they read a book on it and they think that's all they have to do to get $1 million. And it's like, that's a recipe for disappointment right there.
Well, and also, that idea of I've got to have $1 million to be happy. A lot of the manifestation models are based on an external solution to an internal problem. And you've got to come from a place of wholeness and a place of connection, to who we really are, that we are perfect, whole, and complete as an immortal soul. Unfortunately, most of us, in this physical dimension haven't been fully in touch with that. And so we seek externally to find answers and to feel fulfilled. And that will never happen, to seek for external solutions. They are temporary fixes.
Yeah, it's material solutions to a spiritual problem.
Yeah.
Trying to fill that hole with drugs or cars or whatever.
Where there's a lot of, and even actually with therapy, I feel sometimes people use that. Does that make sense? They form an attachment to therapy and they don't want to move past the issue. They almost want to marinate in the issue because that's they've taken that on as their identity. Their identity is that they are this way and they don't know who they are if they're not anxious and depressed, etc.
It's like all they know. So, part of my goal is to be able to put myself out of a job, is not to have people be dependent on therapy. But a lot of people just don't know what the alternative is. If I give up this identity as this depressed person or whatever, I hear a lot of people say, then who will I be? They have no sense of what their true identity is. So when they get a taste of that, the alternative to that, and they begin to break through some of the barriers and have the experience of that deep sense of peace and well-being, kind of being in that zone of, all is well, then that fearful part begins to calm down a bit. It's like, oh, right. Even if they've only had moments of that, it's bringing them back to that experience, deep connection with their authentic self, and that creates hope.
So one of my, for lack of a better word or term, soul purposes that I feel is like really important that when I was going through my own process, has really going back to my early childhood, this has been important to me. So it just kind of like, I feel like I kind of got off my path. Like I was doing pretty well on my path and then I went the wrong way for a while. I was very intuitive, artistic person when I was younger. And then I made a decision in my late teens to pursue a career path that was very pragmatic and practical and not intuitive at all. And I mean, maybe I needed to go down that path just to have that experience. But I feel like I kind of wasted a lot of time and energy doing something that was counter to really who I am. I'm glad I did that because it helped me understand the other side of things.
Right.
I always, in our other podcasts, I've talked about there's kind of like, there's intuitive types and there's engineer types. For, there's people who are both, but
yeah, that's interesting.
A lot of
that you
people
said your husband is an environmentalist environmental engineer, but also interested.
Like a lot of people have a very linear, analytical, mathematical way of looking at the world, and other people are very free-flowing and artistic. And I had to learn that very linear, analytical way of looking at things as an adult. And now I feel like I kind of speak their language to a certain extent. And I felt that like one of my purposes was trying to get the two to talk to each other, because there's so much, like if you go talk to a room full of physicists and you start talking about how they need to accept that they have an immortal soul that's made out of love, they'll look at you like you have two heads. And if you go to a room full of intuitive healer types and you start trying to explain to them, like, I don't know, how neurons work or whatever, they'll look at you like you have two heads. And so like I've been feeling like I'm like trapped in between these two worlds, and I'm like trying to explain to one, like, okay, no, they're right about this, but you're right about this. And to wrap up my point, how to explain that whole immortal soul concept to someone without using those words, because they'll stop listening as soon as you use words like that. If you're talking to somebody who's a strict atheist, they've got a PhD in physics, they think all of that's mumbo jumbo, but you see them in their life and they're manifesting the kind of negative behaviors and emotional patterns and whatnot that come from not being in touch with your soul purpose. How do you explain to someone like that why it's so important to have that
I mean, you have to use the language of the person that you're working with, but sometimes they can relate to things like flashes of insight, where they, even those analytical type people, left brain types of people, do have intuitive flashes, or times when they're they come up with these solutions to problems or whatever that just kind of come out of the blue. Sometimes if you talk about that, those flashes of intuition, those insights, and where that might have come from, it gets them to thinking about, maybe there is something else here.
I think flow state is a common term that I've heard.
Yeah.
Like that's easy to explain to an artist type, somebody who makes music or draws, where you say,
I'm pretty sure inventors have that same experience.
It just comes from. I feel like as an artist, my best artwork I can't claim credit for. It just came from somewhere. I don't know why I drew what I drew, and that drawing's better than anything else I've ever done. And like I kind of almost like I'm like I can't even claim credit for this. Like my hand did it, but I didn't. Maybe inventors, because they want to make money on what they do, they don't want to acknowledge that. And maybe they do.
I think
feel
some
that?
of them do. I mean,
you hear stories like Tesla said he had visions, and that's how he knew how to make his his generator. He had a vision that just came from nowhere.
Yeah, Einstein and some of the great, some of the mathematicians have got kind of downloads of insights and ideas that, you may not call that intuition, but many left brain types will identify with that. Oh, yeah, I got that idea out of the blue,
I think a lot of the issues between people who claim to be quote-unquote spiritual and people who claim to be rational, strictly, may be primarily word choice.
Yeah. They actually
we got to listen to Hawking talk about the universe and how it's just
I watched his biopic the other night, and I was like, he's going on and on and on about how this proves that there's no God, but the thing that he's describing is God by my definition.
Exactly. It's a matter of semantics.
I was actually curious about this. Since you do past life regression and that type of therapy, are patients very open to that, or do you generally work with the type of patients who are open to that? Because I know some people, for example, from a very strict, a certain religious upbringing may just be totally opposed to that. I mean, or do you just talk to them and see where they come from, what their worldview is?
Yeah, I work with whatever, the person's worldview is. I certainly don't impose my worldview on a client in terms of where they're coming from. But I would have to say most of the people that come to me are pretty open-minded and are seeking it out, and they're ready for it. Maybe they've tried a lot of other things and they feel stuck. Nothing's working. So they want to get to the root of it, and, the possibility is that it's in another lifetime. The past life regression often will bring it to the surface for healing. Yeah, but not everybody is open to that, and that's fine. There's many different ways of accessing the deep unconscious, but most of the people who come to me are pretty open and want that holistic perspective.
That's kind of where I was where I was going with it as far as trying to get, I almost kind of see it as like almost tribal at a certain point. You have kind of like the science tribe and the spiritual tribe, and like they disagree and they're really kind of saying the same thing, but there's a lot of strife and conflict. And I just kind of think that's, when it comes to humanity evolving past this, like you said, putting yourself out of a job to where we don't need therapy when we're adults, things are a little bit more in balance. Like, I think that's what I've kind of narrowed down as like the most important link, is that getting those two people to kind of speak the same language. At some level, speak the same language so that they respect each other, aren't adversarial about it, because they both do have, we wouldn't have cell phones or air conditioning if we didn't have science, and we wouldn't have, the Sistine Chapel if we didn't have intuition.
Absolutely. No, you're right. We need both. And I think we're evolving in that direction. I mean, I think quantum physics is starting to give us more of the paradigm that will help you explain some of this phenomenon. We're not completely there yet, but we're headed in that direction. So I agree with you.
Yeah, I definitely think that when we talked to the monk about Taoism, I've studied science my whole life and I've studied Taoism my whole life, and I've never seen a conflict between the two. And the way I've often described it to our guests is, I think it's really egotistical of our modern society to think ancient people were stupid, that they were around for a long time and they did a lot of thinking, and they may not have had electron microscopes, but you can accomplish a lot with a thought experiment. And there's a reason why Taoism starts to sound so much like quantum physics at a certain point, that they use different words and they're a different culture, so they use metaphors and stuff that we're not familiar with, but like really they're kind of talking about the same thing.
Exactly. Yeah. That ancient wisdom, we're just in some cases updating the language to fit the current culture.
Well, going back, talking about the various parts of ourselves that we need to accept, last one I want to touch on is you talked about forgiveness and learning to embrace your shadow, which kind of talks on what we were talking about before, is people feel like they can have some kind of therapy or spiritual experience, etc., meditative experience, and they can just skip doing all of the shadow work, but that doesn't seem to be true. And can you tell us a little bit about how you incorporate that into practice?
Yeah, I think you raise a really, really good point. That's the other thing that I've noticed in some of the New Age thought systems is kind of skipping steps, just focusing on the positive and kind of sweeping the disowned parts of ourselves under the rug and not really owning that. And the problem with that is it affects us unconsciously. It comes through whether we're aware of it or not. The thing is, if we're willing to look at the parts of ourselves that we don't like, that are hidden and buried, and we do that with compassion, it helps us to be fully authentic and present and to reconnect with that peace of mind that is possible. Sugarcoating it, it's like putting deodorant on a garbage pile. Eventually the stench is going to come through. But a lot of people are afraid to look at their shadow and feel ashamed of it. We have to have compassion, for ourselves.
Absolutely. I think what you're getting at, too, is it's the first step to self-love, is loving all the parts of yourself. A friend of mine posted on New Year's Day, she's like, instead of getting rid of the old self and embracing your new self, why don't you learn to love your old self for what he or she was? And I thought that was really great. And I think that's really the key right there to moving forward, is coming to a place where you can, accept all the parts of yourself. Even the parts you might not like, you can still love them. Even like another person might upset you, but you might still love them anyway. So you got to do the same thing to yourself.
Yes, the more you have compassion for those disowned parts of yourself, the more you can have compassion for others in their shadow part. So it's an important part of the healing process, is the willingness to go into those places, reclaim all parts of the self. And when you do that, it can be healed. But it can't be healed if you've got your judging critic that's in charge of the process, because it's going to look at, those shameful parts, condemn it. So that just keeps it hidden and unconscious. So I use a lot of different methods to help people work with their shadow in a compassionate way, dialoguing with the different split off parts from the higher self, the wise, compassionate adult self. Because often these parts are inner child parts that are stuck in the past, that are holding these wounds and beliefs that are based on old information from the past. But when you embrace them with unconditional love, they can be brought to the light and be released and healed. So I'm glad you raised that issue, because it's a huge one, and a lot of people skip steps.
Yeah, I had a really interesting experience the other day that reminded me of what you just said. I have a bad back. I had an injury horseback riding when I was a teenager, and it came back, when I was like mid-20s, and just progressively got worse and worse. And I'm in a lot of pain a lot of the time, and I lose a lot of sleep because I'm in pain. And I was awake at 4:30 in the morning and a lot of pain, and I started writing like a little essay about the experience of hurting my back on Facebook, and just the experience of like what it's like to be, in chronic pain, and how frustrating it can be to have something, that hurts so bad, but other people can't see it, So like, you're just having a normal interaction at work, and you're trying to be friendly, but your back is really aggravated, and you're like, okay. And like just trying to get through it so you can go sit down for a second. And so I wrote this little essay, and I clicked post, and instantly my back stopped hurting. And it was such a spooky, like, I was like, okay, that was weird. And it rarely doesn't hurt at all. So like it was just absolutely immediate. Like, from one second to the next, just recounting the story of how I hurt back made my back feel better.
Yeah, I mean, even body symptoms can be an important indicator of other things that are going on. And I had one man, and he's given me permission to talk about it, who had severe arthritis. This man's business was, like a trainer, a personal trainer, and he could barely walk. His arthritis was progressing so badly. And when we got in touch with what that arthritis was trying to tell him, what we discovered was, as a child, he had a father that was very, very demanding and had high expectations. No pain, no gain philosophy, like in sports. So this young man had grown up with this idea that you just push yourself to the max. So he got his self-esteem through achievement. But his father had died at a very, very young age from a heart attack and kind of worked himself to death. So my client came to understand that his arthritis was getting him to slow down and really trying to save his life, because if he kept going at the pace he was going, he was not going to make it. He did some inner spiritual work and started meditating and centering himself, doing some of his spiritual work, began to see that his self-worth was not dependent on winning trophies and external achievement. Got more of a sense of his self-worth as being inside of him. And he brought much more balance into his life, and his arthritis just disappeared. It became a barometer for him. It's like whenever he kind of reverted back into his old habits, overachieving, overworking, it signaled back to him that he needed to get back on course. So sometimes, those bodily symptoms are there for a reason, and if you can get to the root of it, it can be very helpful in the message that it's giving you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Susan, for speaking with us today. The name of her book is Soul Visioning, Clear the Past, Create Your Future, by Susan Wisehart. Susan, do you have any events or other books or other projects that are coming up for you?
Yes, I am doing a workshop based on my book, Soul Visioning. That is going to be at the Theosophical Society on Thursday, I believe, February 21st, and then a workshop on Saturday, February 23rd at the Theosophical Society on the soul visioning process. And then I'll be at the Body, Mind, Spirit Expo in North Lake doing a group past life regression on Sunday, March 3rd. And all that information is on my website, susanwisehart.com.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I enjoyed it very much.
Yes, thank you both. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Keep up the great work you're doing.
Well, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. That he needed to get back on course. So sometimes, those bodily symptoms are there for a reason, and if you can get to the root of it, it can be very helpful in the message that it's giving you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Susan, for speaking with us today. The name of her book is Soul Visioning, Clear the Past, Create Your Future, by Susan Wisehart. Susan, do you have any events or other books or other projects that are coming up for you?
Yes, I am doing a workshop based on my book, Soul Visioning. That is going to be at the Theosophical Society on Thursday, I believe February 21st, and then a workshop on Saturday, February 23rd at the Theosophical Society on the soul visioning process. And then I'll be at the Body, Mind, Spirit Expo in North Lake doing a group past life regression on Sunday, March 3rd. And all that information is on my website, susanwisehart.com.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I enjoyed it very much.
Yes, thank you both. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Keep up the great work you're doing.
Well,
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. I believe February 21st, and then a workshop on Saturday, February 23rd at the Theosophical Society on the soul visioning process. And then I'll be at the Body, Mind, Spirit Expo in North Lake doing a group past life regression on Sunday, March 3rd. And all that information is on my website, susanwisehart.com.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I enjoyed it very much.
Yes, thank you both. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Keep up the great work you're doing.
Well,
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. On Sunday, March 3rd, and all that information is on my website, susanwisehart.com.
Thank you so much for coming on the show.
I enjoyed it very much.
Yes, thank you both. Happy New Year.
Yeah, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Keep up the great work you're doing.
Well,
thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us for the Conscious Community Podcast. If you'd like more information about sponsoring this podcast or advertising with Conscious Community Magazine, in print or online, please email me at spencer@consciouscommunitymagazine.com. That's SPENCER, or call 630-492-0831.